Addiction never affects just the addict. It affects all of us. Recovering from addiction and alcoholism is also a life-changing battle for families dealing with a loved one's addiction. Numerous programs support addicts as they reclaim their lives, while their families face their own challenges without the same guidance. You're listening to Voices InCourage with KL Wells, where we transform the lives of the families and loved ones of addicts and alcoholics from surviving to thriving in the midst of chaos. Tune in as we highlight vulnerable stories of families who have addicted relatives and friends and learn how they have dealt with the challenges of isolation, desperation, and shame. If you are seeking ways to live your best life, then we welcome you into this safe space. Be a part of change today with your host, KL Wells.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Voices InCourage Podcast. I am very excited today to be hosting alongside with KL Wells, where we're going to flip the tables a little bit, where I'm going to ask KL some questions, because believe it or not, we are exactly 1 year into the podcast. So congratulations, KL. Here we are 1 year later, and we have committed to and held strong to podcasts a month, which means 12 times 2 is 24, and we will have 25 episodes at our 1 year anniversary. So congratulations and welcome.
Absolutely. Yes. So I remember the day that you floated this notion and I just about had a heart attack. And so I think it's remarkable that I just had a moment, I had to breathe. And then I said, okay. And we found a company to help us figure this thing out. And we have had some remarkable conversations in the last year that have changed our audience's lives and mine. And I'm so blessed that we've had the opportunity to do this and we'll continue to do this. So let's have a little revisit of the last year.
Exactly. Yeah. Nothing beats a real live conversation. And, in doing all the research and wanting to be where all of you are at and where all of our listeners are and where our community is growing, being on the podcast, it is the best place to be. And it's an opportunity for us to have great conversations, memorable conversations, and really provide some insights that we may not normally see on a day-to-day basis, or we get bogged down with our own daily lives and our stories that, sometimes hold us back. But these conversations are meant for us to move forward in breaking down those past generational cycles. So speaking of memorable moments, I'm curious. Anything that stands out to you where it was just kind of a aha, or things that have really kind of settled in your heart, your soul, your mind that just kind of, just really struck a chord with you?
Well, I think first and foremost is we set about doing this podcast to have a very different conversation taking place in the marketplace, because most of the podcasts that are out there are recovering addicts, alcoholics, substance abuse disorder folks. And we have yet to find a podcast that is for the loved ones. And I'm a loved one. And there are so many more of us out there that don't have a voice and are in the shadows, so to speak. And so I think the thing that really first just stands out to me is the courage that some of our guests have had to have some serious, raw and real conversations about, just the devastation, the grief, the shattered dreams, wow, just didn't see this coming. And now what? And then in the midst of it, pain shows up for us so that we get to do our own work.
Right.
And we have this tendency as a loved one to think, just fix them and we'll all be fine. And so just kind of stepping into that pool of the conversation has been really fascinating too. And so one person that stood out along those lines was a very successful CEO that woke up one day and realized that his son was an addict. His daughter was massively struggling and his marriage was in shambles. And so he almost was living this double life, which, I work with execs and CEOs, and success in large places is still professional success, which leaves the family to kind of navigate on their own. And to Andy's tremendous credit as a man, as a husband, as a father, he opted to come back home and do his work. And what I loved, he told me, was that his son, Scott, who was dealing with substance abuse disorder, basically said, when Andy asked him, what can I do to support you? Scott said, just do your work, Dad. just do your work. And I think about that quite often because, we're still in the throes of our story. And I just keep thinking, just keep doing your work. Just keep doing your work. So that one stands out for me. Then there's Jeff Bristol, who is recovering. And I actually didn't do that interview. Jen Stein on our team did that interview because she knew him. And that interview came at a really pivotal time for me, as most of them do, honestly. And he spoke to never, never, never lose hope. And this was at a moment when we found out that my son was addicted to fentanyl. And that just kind of took the air out of the room and the hope out of our souls. Yeah. And so listening to Jeff, I grabbed a hold of what he said and have never let go. And so those two are the first two that pop into my mind. And then more recently, I've had the privilege and the honor to interview two extraordinary people in really different places. One, Jim Horton, whose son actually did pass away from an overdose 3.5 years ago almost. And to interview this, amazing man with such a vibrant soul of service on the other side of the heartbreak of losing his son, his only son. Mm-hmm. And we did 2 interviews with Jim because I just had more questions to ask him, and he was so emotionally available. And so I have thought, if at some point we face this ourselves, because it's always a possibility, he would be almost the first person I would be reaching out to ask for help. Right. And that's one of the things we've learned along the way is asking for help is mission critical to navigating this. And then another recent one is Mary Beth O'Connor, who just wrote a book and released a book called From Junkies, which is a harrowing, traumatizing story that honestly, she's a miracle walking and awe-inspiring in her story of decades of trauma and substance abuse, and her climbing up out of the darkness to take a hold of the light and create service in the world now today, having gone through Berkeley Law School and then becoming a federal judge. She's wicked smart, brilliant, and had her own life's traumas that she really needed to take a hold of, deal with, and incorporate in who she is today. And so, again, reminded me that no matter how long you've been doing drugs or alcohol or the things you're doing, there is always hope as long as there's a breath.
Right. Well, it's fun to reflect back on when we even named the community and to think about all the different stories and the voices that we've heard and the courage it takes to stand in those and to be able to finally hear people that are willing to express and willing to share, willing to be vulnerable. And what's great and what I felt most proud about the podcast too is being able to see multiple angles of how all these conversations are happening. We're seeing inside the executive world, right? What's happening when we lead these dual lives and how we're having to deal with that. We've got the families that are completely at a loss for resources, scrambling for things, which is exactly why you even thought about putting this together. And then third, the addicts themselves that are in recovery, being able to share what those stories are. And we're learning a lot that what the addict goes through in terms of recovering from certain things and the processes that we take. You and I were just talking about relapse prevention and the fact that there's so many similarities that we can learn from one another. Yet we haven't done a very good job of giving those resources to the other side of the story, to the families.
Right. Yeah. And so just quick story is one of the rehabs that Sam was in, I remember going to the front desk and saying, what do you recommend for loved ones? And kind of getting this look like, what do you mean? What do we recommend for loved ones? And I'm like, well, isn't there something I should be reading or watching or anything along those lines? And finally, somebody from the back of the office area said, there's a really good video that you should watch. And for the life of me, the title is escaping me right now, but it is on our resource list. And it was done by a doctor who actually struggled with addiction himself. And he was going through his own exploration as to whether this is a disease or it's just a choice. And the brain science that he went through, because I ordered the video, was illuminating for me. And I'm a big learner. And so give me information. I want to understand this disease. I wanted to understand what was going through the addict's mind. And I wanted to understand what was the turnkey when they decided that they were going to actually really take this on and lean into a long-term recovery. And there are so many answers to those questions. And so that kind of information was mission critical for me personally, but it also illuminated that the fact that we're not given the information, we have to go look for it. And so again, I remember another conversation I had with Sparkle, who's a very dear friend of mine. And she said to me, you do realize that you're just a transaction. You're not a mom. So Sam's coming to me to get money so he can buy drugs. If I say no, it in his mind, it's like next. And I'm still thinking I'm relationship building with my son. And he's like, she's like, no, that is not what's happening here. And that, again, was illuminating that addict brain is operating at such a level that its whole thing is wired for survival. And that means getting drugs. And that means getting money to get drugs or doing it whatever way. And just the hijacking of brains has been mind-bending for me to remind myself of the difference.
Yeah, absolutely.
And stay clear about that.
Right. And then one of the things, and I definitely want to make sure we touch on this, is being able to break down the barriers and the conversations that we're having in the workplace. Being able to address addiction, substance abuse in the workplace. And it's at the top. It doesn't discriminate. We see it all the time in C-level executives and
absolutely.
And in this space of having to live a dual life, but at the same time, we haven't created an acceptable culture around having the conversation. It's happening, but it's very, very slow. Same way we would have talked about mental health 10, 15 years ago, now we're finally starting to break down that barrier too. Specifically, when we think about that, what are some elements of those conversations that you feel need to be brought to the light and things that are changing that are shifting the paradigm?
Well, first and foremost, 1 out of 3 American families is dealing with substance abuse disorder. So you look around a C-suite, 1 out of 3 people sitting in that room is either dealing with substance abuse disorder themselves or they have a family member. So you are to the right or to the left of you looking at the disease. And we have this illusion and denial that it is that pervasive. And so we don't have a conversation about it because it's still steeped in the stigma of you've done something wrong and you need to fix it, or the judgment and the shame. And shame is pervasive and it's a silencer and therefore it's a killer. And that is another reason why Voices InCourage is so important, is because we've got to come out and have these conversations. We've got to drop the veils of stigma and shame and judgment, because honest to goodness, the vast majority of people are dealing with this subject. And, in the circles, just in communities, how many people have lost spouses, sons, daughters, nephews, nieces, parents to overdoses? It is just as prevalent now as it used to be back when I grew up in the 60s and 70s, when you would say, oh, somebody has cancer. It is shocking. And we're in a pandemic and we're not talking about it. We're not dealing with it at the level that it deserves and actually demands.
Well, I will tell you, as in recovery myself, it took me, maybe up until year 5 to really start to let go of the shame. So I think there's so much of that, and it's not shame from others as much as it is self-shaming, lack of self-forgiveness. And it really is that internal civil war. It wasn't until being more open and having honest dialogue and being able to be carefree about it. And I'm not saying everyone needs to be this way, but that's what was my medicine, was in order to let go of the shame and let go of the guilt and have that forgiveness and all that stuff. It was this opportunity to share it. And then it was kind of like this aha moment of, geez, if we had more of this sharing, imagine how others would let this go. Because what ends up happening is when you bottle all that up, even in sobriety, it just creates more problems. And then you're battling multiple things at the same time. So just because you go into recovery doesn't mean everything's, peachy keen, but that adds another layer of stress to loved ones and coworkers. And, it creates that kind of ripple effect.
Well, so as you're saying this, what I'm thinking about is, if we don't talk about it, we're left to our own devices, which means we're in our own heads. And honest to goodness, that's where the MSUs are. We're making shit up. And most of the time it is stuff we're making up that absolutely does not serve us. It keeps us in that drain of crisis. It keeps us in that drain of struggling. It keeps us in that drain of surviving. And just the notion of giving ourselves grace in our own humanity. We're all doing the best we can. And, it took me a while to be able to look in the mirror after my entire life has been surrounded by this disease, to be able to say, man, at every step along the way, I've just been doing the best I can. And I just keep putting one foot forward and getting help and talking to people and reading and continuing to have these conversations. It's going to be never ending until I take my last breath. So I think the lifelong journey of being a human.
Yeah. And I was just thinking about this earlier today. Anything that surprised you or that you weren't expecting, or something that just kind of went, gosh, I'd never thought about it that way. And here's the reason I bring it up.
Yeah.
you and I had a conversation recently around the similarities. And I always thought that my situation being in recovery had its own unique path, and there were no similarities in what my family would have to go through. And then all of a sudden one day you said, hey, what's your relapse prevention plan look like? And I thought to myself, well, why would she want that? I mean, is that something? And then I was like, oh, wait a minute. They look very similar. And realizing that as we're still creating these divides in these siloed areas of thinking, that to me was kind of an aha for me, and thinking about additional conversations. I mean, that's a whole topic in itself, but was wondering if there was anything that just kind of struck you as being surprising.
Well, I think that's a brilliant one to illuminate is, we do have this notion that your recovery plan is different than our recovery plan. And I remember having a conversation with you and another gentleman, and we were talking about the books that we were reading. And I was like, well, your library is my library. We're all reading the 4 Agreements. We're all reading The Power of Now. We're all reading, very similar things. And then I began to kind of noodle with this more recently because Sam had another relapse, multiple relapses in the last couple months. And I thought every time he relapsed, I relapsed. I was at not completely, because I've done a lot of work, but there's still an angst when the person that you love the most and you want the most for relapses. And they go in that dark hole again. And as soon as I would hear that, there'd be like a hurt, an ache in my heart. And I thought, that's my relapse. Now, what do I do with that? Because I don't want to ache every single time. Because honestly, this last journey, he has gotten clean and sober for 4 or 5 days and relapsed. So he's probably done, 5 relapses in the last 2 months. Well, I don't have the capacity to relapse every time he relapses, So I was like, okay, I need to take a look at this and explore this notion that my emotional health and wellness is predicated on whether he's relapsed or not relapsed. Nope. So again, it's work. It is to recognize that, his crisis in his relapse and his disease isn't my crisis.
Right.
So the 2 phone calls I got in the middle of the night just recently, I didn't answer them because his crisis isn't my crisis. So that, I would say, is illuminating for most parents. It was for me. It's taken practice to get to the point where I can say, no, his crisis isn't mine. I do think this notion that, they just need to hit bottom. Well, I mean, bottoms, when you talk
bottom is so people, relative.
Oh my goodness, there are so many different bottoms. Well, if you think you're waiting for a certain bottom and they just blow through that bottom. I mean, the ultimate bottom, obviously, is that they overdose and pass away. But that's not what we're looking for here. And so, again, their addiction is our addiction. We're waiting to figure out, where's their bottom? Is it going to be here? Is it going to be there? Wow. Okay, disconnect from that craziness too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And this just reminds me too that for all of our listeners, if there's a certain topic, a certain story, a certain something that you want more information on, please feel free to put in the comments. what you're looking for. We'll have a ton of conversations moving forward, but it's always great to hear from our listeners specifically. And you can always reach out on our website, voicesencourage.com. Definitely sign up for our list and be able to have, more direct conversation. I just wanted to remind our listeners that there's an opportunity for us to design this podcast together. It's not just about us having conversations. So feel free to engage. Okay. So the big question for me, 25 episodes, a year into it, what's next? Where are we going? Where do you see the podcast? What does success and future visioning look like?
Well, I just believe that the more conversations we have, the more up-leveling we do in terms of those conversations, the higher profile people that we continue to have conversations with, people who have written books. I just see it as a spider web that just keeps growing. And because I believe that just from a visionary perspective, we need to create a web of conversations and inclusion for all parties concerned. And particularly for the people who live in this space of a loved one, is we're not having enough real, raw, and honest conversations. And quite frankly, I've heard so many people talk to the notion that, my brother was an addict, that was a while ago, I don't want to talk about it anymore. And that generally is coming from a place of, that was too painful, I don't want to revisit the pain. And if it's still too painful to revisit the pain, you're still carrying the pain with you. And you may not think that's the case, but that is absolutely the case. And so we've got to learn how to almost embrace the pain, work with the pain, and release the pain and heal. And that's only going to come through some work and conversations. And so I see us as, just at the forefront of some real conversations, and that's just going to continue to grow and grow and grow. And we're going to create a movement here of conversations of people that are courageous enough to tell the truth, to talk about where they are in their journey. Because, as we say, I'm still in my journey around this. I don't have all the answers. I'm still evolving. I'm still growing. I'm still learning from every single conversation I have, which is what I love about this. And I said, quite frankly, recently that this podcast has been such a great source of support and illumination and hope and courage for me in the midst of this. So that's what I hope for millions of people.
I agree. I'm right there with you. I think it's an opportunity, and in terms of my vision, is one more conversation can lead to 100, 500, 1,000. And the more that I talk and connecting with others, it's so great that having a conversation with somebody literally becomes a voice of permission.
Yes.
For them to let go too. And I think that's what I love about this podcast, is hopefully it's giving again, those voices who not necessarily feel silenced, but haven't found a way in which that they can connect with others in a way that's non-judgmental, that's safe, that doesn't affect, the reputation of the family and that sort of thing. But interesting, it is rare, and I can't even recall, and I think I would have recalled if this happened, any conversation that I've had with someone where they're like, why would you tell me that? Or why are you doing this? Or whatever it is. It's only been met with kindness, compassion, and curiosity. And the curiosity to me is a awesome tool to start getting the conversation more dialed in, which is comforting, because I think for the first 5 years of my journey, that was my biggest fear. It was being judged. And the fact that the scarlet letter, that's like, everyone can see me, everyone can see this, giant A on my chest. But when you can convert that story into a badge of courage, and be able to share it with others, it is that permissive voice. So that's kind of my wish, is that we continue to open up and offer those permission slips, per se.
Absolutely. Well, there's two things about that for me that stick out. One is for people to realize that they are never alone.
Right.
And so many people feel they're in this alone. So breaking down those barriers is mission critical. And then number two is we can thrive in the midst of this chaos and disease and destruction and heartbreak. And so most people are not thinking that. They're thinking they're either in crisis, or they're massively struggling, or they're trying to survive. And I early on decided that surviving was not good enough for me. I have a life that I love, and I want a life that's about thriving. And so how was I going to thrive in the midst of a shattered heart around this disease? And so I started looking for how to do that. And, the fastest way to learn something is to find a model. And quite frankly, I have not talked to somebody yet who is, quote, thriving in the midst of the disease. Going to look until I find them. So most of the time I will say I consider myself in that thriving space, but man, the last couple months I have, dipped back down and gone sideways and cattywampus. And I've had my moments of surrender and all the things. I think I'm just doing it at a little higher level than when we first started this journey. So It's like a stair step of turning it back to thriving more quickly.
I was going to say, every response gets stronger and stronger. I'll equate it to this, and having a conversation with a gentleman the other day, and his message to everyone is how I trained for a quadruple bypass.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, what does that mean? He knew he was destined for heart issues. It was genetic. It was there. Having smoked 5 packs of cigarettes, like all that kind of stuff. But what he was doing was he was doing his squats and he was doing his walking, he was doing his jump rope. So by the time he had his quadruple bypass, he was standing within the first 5 hours. He was walking within the first day or two. And after 5 days, he's back at home, thriving better than he had before. And now at the age of 68, he's healthier than ever. He said the nurses were ready for him to need help out of the bed. He just stood right up. He's like, those are my squats, all of those things. But, you think about the more muscle that you put into it.
Yes.
When you have a quadruple bypass and you're going to have, which is your setback or your relapse.
Yes.
Those muscles in place, the muscle memory that's there to catch you.
Yeah. And so I love that story. And the corresponding story on our side is building emotional muscles.
Yeah.
And so that's what I'm in the process right now of doing with a program called Positive Intelligence. That's a 7-week long program. And it is me working the program to build my positive intelligence muscles on a consistent basis throughout the day to rewire my brain to be able to shift more quickly. And this is the power of, I think, the times that we're living in is we have enough information and research now to know that we can rewire our neural pathways. We can train ourselves for change in a way that serves us at a much higher level. And when I'm operating at a higher level, I make much better decisions around this disease than if I wasn't. So brilliant analogy.
Yeah. Never thought about that before. But anyways, I wanted to have this conversation with you. I think I do remember specifically, no word for word, but when I said, oh yeah, when you get the podcast going and it was like deer in the headlights. Whoa, wait a minute, hold on. But I think it was only a few months later that we got right into it. And I love the fact that we've stayed true to it. I love the fact that we've been consistent. I love the fact that, the variety of guests has just been far more than I imagined. And I'm excited for what's to come. And we've got an incredible list of ideal guests that we're going to be reaching out to. So stay tuned for some pretty high profile, powerful guests.
So I do want to say we've had some therapists that have come to the table that I want to give some kudos to, and that's Bill Crawford and Ken Clark and Vanessa Sexton. Just brilliant, heart-centered, doing amazing work in the world. And we're able to bring grace and forgiveness and gratitude and skill sets to the table for all of us in how we can navigate this in a much more heart-centered way for ourselves.
Yeah. I also want to do a shout out to the moms that have been courageous enough. One being my own wife, Jennifer, but also Janet. Janet being bold and courageous enough to be able to share her story and what she's been going through. And, sometimes and I can't even imagine watching a child go through it like you have. You're in that same category as a mom. But those have been some incredibly powerful stories that I know I've learned a lot from. And it's always good to see a different perspective. So,
Well, we have Joanne and Sarah too. I mean,
Sure.
Joanne's the mom, Sarah is the daughter-in-law, and Bart is the son, husband. And they navigated this. And then they came together when Bart passed away to raise the two kids, Joanne's grandkids and Sarah's kids and Bart's kids, of course. And I could feel him with us when we did that podcast. It was palpable in terms of his presence. And they have woven an extraordinary family on the other side of that devastating loss.
Yeah.
So such courageous people.
It really is. I know. And our stories will live on and continue. And, as we wrap up, I just really excited for what's to come. And congratulations again on 25 episodes, a year into it, staying consistent, staying strong, and being able to reach as many people as possible. And if you're listening, please share this, give permission to others to do the same, and let's help change the narrative together. Any parting comments, KL, that you'd like to address with the audience?
Please, please, please share this with people who need to hear a positive, a hopeful voice, and to actually hear a voice that is theirs, to know that they are never alone in this. There are resources out there. There are places they can reach out to, and they never, ever have to do this on their own. That is one of the main things, one of the main reasons why we started this. And so please, send this on to others who need a sense of hope and a different way to navigate this disease.
Well, and to your point, and I'll end with this, you not being able to find the resources that you needed and having to go search for them. That's our goal. You don't have to go searching again. Just come, right? They're here.
Yes.
Voices are here. The resources, the tools are here. The stories, the people, it's all here. So thank you again, KL. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
Again next time.
All right.
Thank you for joining us in this episode. We hope this discussion gives you the empowerment you need during these challenging times. Remember, there is always light after darkness. For more inspiring conversations like this one, subscribe to the show at voicesincourage.com/podcast. We encourage you to share with your friends and family going through similar situations so we can continue to build a strong community of hope and possibility. Start your life-changing journey today. Join our community at voicesincourage.com.